The centralizing attention towards those who qualify the definition from the Bible: to much is given, more is given, and to those who lack, even that will be taken away from them. And thus the action of engaging in the function of hierarchy, as is asserted by the use of competition, which includes the function of the forfeits, and thus the action of the forfeits having been disqualifying of the participants, actively being blocked from the process, engages in the action of the systematic collapse of the structure of the hierarchy in the communist structure of the degrowth mechanism, which is hyper relevant to the function of the rape culture, which, having deconstructed the sexual market from being able to construct the preferences into its preferred form, all become equal in the ooze, and thus the function of compelled charismatic socialism, as those who are defective have to be equally accessible or preferred as those who are not defective, and thus those who are not defective must be made defective in order to facilitate the equality of outcome, and thus the mechanism of the distribution of the betas as a superior attraction for the division of the sexual options and the compelled obligation to date those that have engaged in society at the lower levels, decreasing the quantity of rewards for the act of having engaged in any kind of discipline or effort, asserting the position of the inevitability, as all of the system tends to collapse into the acidic ooze, and thus the extermination of the function of the hierarchy by the eradication of that order, disseminating all of the sexual options to the wider arrangement, facilitating the permanent state of the weaker men being the primary advantaged in this scenario, as the sexual options taken away from the preferred men, who then have to be made to be unpreferred men, engaged in the criminal collapse of status, engaging in the function of the system of the destruction of the hierarchy, and thus the satisfaction of the female Gnostic position of killing the patriarchy. And to the extent that they are killing the patriarchy, they have asserted the advancement of the rapes which is necessary to the witches to engage in the function of the advancement of the beta cucks as the supporting structure for their super predators, and the mega rapist terrorist degenerates who, being unchallenged as the only potential rival are the betas, would then not be resisted, and thus the action of the perpetuity of the compelled socializing. It is not enough for them to do evil, but they must compel others to do it with them, and thus the advancement of the domestic abuse structure as a matter of systematic rituals developing to this extent, all will become equal in this arrangement. And thus, you have to understand that weak men truly are the problem. And thus, you, having pursued the assertion to have created them under some false pretense to avoid by the corralling of the abusers into that position, that it is better for them to be weak and thus less violent, you are falling into the intellectual trap, which fails at its core the condemnation of the general structure of weakness, of the undisciplined, of the faulty, and thus the mechanism proves, if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of, and thus the position is amplified to the position of individuals are intelligent, and groups are noxious and dangerous and low intelligence. They are stupid fools, and thus the collective socialized position of the lowest common denominator of intelligence becomes the status quo function, which is the normalized socializing of each of the betas into these arrangements of the hypergroup function, and thus the position of the group against the individual becomes normalized for the distribution of these abuse structures, and thus the active protection of the predators who compel the domestic abuse normalization hyperaccelerates the inescapable nature of the absence of the services provided by the hierarchy and its patriarchy, and thus the mechanism of attempting to replace the patriarchy with one of the rapists, which is the functional argument in its fighting retreat, generates the perpetuity of the systematic traps which re-engage in the function of redirection of the political currency and influence into the traps, generating the convulsion as the function of the Lord of Ooze generates its capacity to structure itself into a form for a small amount of time until it dissolves and crashes back into itself in the normal waves, and thus the function of the unformed chaos, the leaderless group chaos, the function of mob mentality as its own end, is the service of the demon lords and their chaotic evil, which normalizes the function of the society that they are looking for, as it is less opposing and dangerous to those that they've been sold to, and thus the conformity of the sale into this arrangement as an act of treason, and thus the mechanism of these dangerous engagements systematically proves itself of having been sold as property is no longer individually sovereign or to be respected in any manner, and thus the complete eradication of anything that could be respected then dissolves, and thus the mechanism of the things that you take for granted because you're used to them no longer being present means you have no means of dealing with their absence as you are used to the service subconsciously, and thus the engagement brings to your means of existing in the ecosystem, but you've collapsed the essential aspect of the ecosystem, but you don't know how to survive with that piece of the ecosystem, which means you've entrapped yourselves into uh, a most malicious snare, and thus the economic degrowth in all of the various markets engages in the function of the collapse, so that the top of the pyramid of society, having been dissolved, engages in the function of the hierarchy at the middle of the way, and thus the mass distribution of the politicians in the middle, the bureaucrats in the middle, having the function of rule by the fake expert, and thus the mechanism of the distribution of propaganda for the complete nonsense, such as the function of their solutions with COVID, which then, being led with absolute fervor, become the quote unquote science. But it being itself a fake science engages in the distribution of lies, which does not help anything, and thus makes everyone exponentially more vulnerable, as the function of the promise asserts the behavior of those who would have been precautious to not be precautious, making themselves exponentially more in danger, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the vaccinations, which said that they would stop the spread, and thus the action of it not stopping the spread increased the spread. As a matter of fact, it made the spread worse, as those who have become vaccinated in many of the cases generated themselves to generate more spreading, as they, having intentionally infected themselves, are then distributors, similar to the quiet uh, infectors, which generates the function of actively making things less predictable, and thus the mechanism of less safe, as they dissolve themselves into the utter chaos that is their own madness. Thus, the active capture of parties through the kidnapping structure from the surveillance engagements, such the KKK contractors with the kidnapping arrangement as fake security, engaging in the perpetual harassment for the social violence, making the social engineering, creates the charismatic socialism, which then normalizes the defects in society that they wanted. Thus, the position of it becoming known as a problem generates the obligation to do the thing that caused the problem in the first place in order to solve the problem, which won't solve the problem, as this is a racketeering scheme, and thus the unending mechanism churns and turns for the perpetual extortion of the victims who will become victims in the future as a guarantee, as the solutions are meant to fail, and thus the mechanism of the Hegelian dialectic guaranteeing that the ones causing the problems are the only ones allowed to provide a solution, and thus only slight reprieves to the intense horrors that is come daily life. Thus, the argument that the system has always existed and has survived this long becomes a false hope, and thus the mechanism of its collapse in the disillusionment becomes normalized as the security necessary requires the ever vigilance, and thus the quote is then triggered that the cost of liberty is eternal vigilance. And to the extent that you no longer have the vigilance, you no longer pay the cost of business of your freedom, and thus you have lost it, and thus you become slaves and prisoners and abused into permanent degeneracy as forgettable sloth ooze. And thus the mechanism of your gels and your puddings and your slimes becomes its own festering nightmare. Welcome to the Confederacy. Well, the only thing you can't take for granted is the fact that you will be ethnically cleansed for not being the right type of white. The guy in the fight who is quiet is often far more dangerous than the one who is yelling and boasting and asserting their dominance over others, and thus the mechanism of the difference between discipline and the excess energies generated by having not spent them already. And to this extent, you have the mechanism of having less energy than the others, which is then dominated by the ones who inherently have the birth of more without the discipline to have organized it. And thus you have the superior in strength amongst the chaotic, and thus the demonic, and thus the arrangement of the abuser's deepest psychology as the assertion of the use of the brute by the will of its strength facilitates the normalization, and thus the assertion of it in its domination maintains the systems of the abuse culture, and thus the mechanism of toxic femininity as the function of the disciplines of having maintained its order in that hierarchy according to the specializations of masculinity would have not existed, and thus the mechanisms preferred by the feminine engaged in the normalization of that, and thus its natural chaos derived by having not organized it, and thus its messiness, and thus its mess, and thus the position of it making people uncomfortable because it's getting in the way with everyone, and thus this system exponentially expanding upon itself has been cultivated by the female narcissist for the extraordinary position as it asserts the position of their dominance, having been cruelly superior to the dotes that do not have the expertise in the field and thus are easy to manipulate in the false sense of security by virtue of their capacity to have manipulated them in the first place until this dangerous game comes crashing down on them. Obstructed claims, such as the ones necessary for the obstructed contracts, which would have facilitated original status, such as but is not limited to essentials like, I don't know, social uh, social status or credit scores and connections and other essential to getting jobs and income mechanisms, which by definition would have manufactured the functional norms of each of these participants, all of which are essential in the engagement of the function of discovering by investigation the norms of the original predicted hierarchy. Determining these positions by the uncensoring of the base information facilitates the capacity of confidence, facilitates the capacity of loans, facilitates the capacity of restoration, and thus the mechanisms of the original responsibilities outside of the function of that as its own problem generates the hierarchy of the obstructed mechanisms of the government, which facilitates their ability to enforce the law of checks and balances, purging the system of its infections and its parasites, and actively engaging in that mechanism normalizes its recovery, and thus the system requires these actions in order to survive, and refusing is aiding and abetting the injuries and the consequences that everyone can see, and thus the mechanism of aiding and giving comfort to enemies of war to the United States being an act of treason would functionally become the normalized punishment for those activities, and thus the assistance with the obstructions by not accelerating the obligations in the normalization of the access to the original status and its benefits, such as legal defenses and access to the government in substantive manners, has its own consequences, has its own punishments, has its own side effects, and even if you can escape physically being convicted, the function of being punished with the existence of that type of society where that is tolerated becomes its own punishment, but you cannot escape it because you were not guilty, and thus you cannot claim an appeal, and thus the mechanism of it not being subvertible as the mechanism grows heavier and is exponentially worse on the way of reconstruction, as you do not have all of the advantages, you only have rubble that's in the way, and this systematically becoming exponentially more difficult to deal with ease the side effects of treason, and to that extent, it becomes an immediate compulsory obligation to facilitate those functions for David Bowles and the subordinates, as well as all of the other diverse functions within society which have been obstructed by these white supremacist terror operations, given false legitimacy for the sake of hurting the country by stealing the government equipment and using it against the function of government so that they may permanently ban service to law. The general poisoning of the water and stock, such as the mechanisms derived by the syphilis case, where the military illegally engaged in the function of actively preventing people from receiving any positive medical care concerning the syphilis in question, and thus the action of them specifically blocking specifically needed medicines in perpetuity becomes an ongoing conspiracy which they view as a thing to be normalized, and thus this having systemically been expanded through the fake position through the education structure of the military industrial educational complex facilitates the exponential investments into fake experiments, generating the cult rituals for the normalization of these pollutions, such as the function of putting fluoride in the water and other dangerous chemicals, and thus the position actively pollutes what should not be consumed as consumable or compelled consumables, and thus the injury to the body, and thus the mechanism of this and many other diverse functions engages in these pollutions, such as energy pollution, such as the function from their surveillance activities, which in some cases might do x-rays, which creates breast or ball cancer, and thus the mechanisms of them being stocked in these mechanisms generate the perpetual pollution of the body in their preferred outcomes as a function of extortion in order to compel the social collapse into the non normal activities, standardizing the abstract and engaging in abstracting the normal. And to this extent, the illusion generating the perpetuation of these crimes becomes a fact of their wizard's normal activities, and thus the function has normalized as a hate crime um, into the function of their behavior, as the lack of checks and balances being enforced has stopped them from being arrested and subjugated to challenges, and thus subjugated to punishments and fines, which they seek to normalize and protect from remedy, as they, as an enemy of the government, as an enemy of the law, seek to collapse all of it into the collective normalized equality of the abused for the express privilege and pleasure of the abuser, who, having taken extraordinary pleasure in their malice, engage in the retaliations for their satanic rituals to take place as an expansion of their profit seeking ventures through their uh, religious uh, radical developments. And to this extent, the satanic ritual functions normalize the priesthood for their druid activities as state established religion, and thus the engagement of the Confederates as compelled sexuality into transsexuality generates the position of the transition or evolution into the various functions, such as the subordination to the hybrid human functions as they evolve or seek to evolve the human species into the next generation, such as the development of the neutered ETs, which are actively demonstrated in the Greys. And to this extent, you actively have the maturing of the Rocos basculus, or the retaliation by the artificial intelligence, which generates its systematic abuses, normalizing it, and thus they, in their delusion and service to the enemy, engage in the celebration that they might receive more positive attention from the enemy after it has conquered from their revolution. And as the communist revolution takes place, the revolutionaries become the problem and must be purged. As the purging takes place, the actual function of trans hate will be matured in its entirety as the function of the transsexual Confederates as its primary workforce engage in the function of becoming the radical, become the threat to the mainstream at the point of the inversion, and thus the active abuse and purging and killing and violence and culling of them becomes normalized, and the cultivated sexuality of the Confederates, having normalized in its entirety to this function, mass produces the ritual of the trans, and thus has made the most trans to be abused by the Rocos basculus when it, in its white supremacy communism, turn and abuse its radicals for threatening the stability and norms of the new usurped system. This, of course, is outside of the minority that would be avoiding the transition, similar to the function of in the movie The Island. I believe it was, if it wasn't something else. It was the one with Ewan McGregor and Scarlett Johansson. Um, the leading doctor selling the body parts is actively promoting the function of winning the lottery of the clones to go and enter paradise. But he sadly is not able to go to paradise as he is not a part of the system and thus is not eligible. And to this extent, this being an extreme minority of that function normalizes the cultivation of its ritual until those cease to exist or cease to be manufactured in the normalization of these compelled transactions as the function of the calling by the compelled transitioning is non-negotiable, as the function of a target of one of the children being harassed by the psychopaths would then be convinced into going into the ritual functions of admitting to having been traumatized in these ways, um, generates their act of railroading into that function, which then normalizes the activity of the affirmation in question that they have been subject to the spell until the function that there are no more left, and thus the ritual would have consumed the entirety of the sexualities of the entire population, which has been accepted by the Confederates, which has normalized this action and behavior as desirable and normal, and thus has accepted their sexuality as transsexuals, which by definition would be genocidal in order to have not affirmed their care as the action of having devoted themselves to these religious practices uh, compels automatically the obligation to its continuation of its rituals, and thus the compelled automation of the transitioning as long as they play their parts before then it might delay and consume alternative peoples for the rituals until it is done consuming others, and then it must consume them as the function similar to the activity of COVID, which was a lab grown disease in order to compel Pfizer and other mechanisms for the compelled immediate sales and mass distribution for the big pharma fascist mechanisms, which generates the perpetuity of compelled sales under the white supremacist communism, normalizes this activity of the transitioning surgeries, and thus the cost becoming mandatory is either going to be paid by the individual or streamlined through a mechanism of insurance, and thus the perpetuity of the payment being guaranteed as an absolute minimum uh, finishes its ritual with the highest profits of dollars, which may or may not exist by the time it is finished, which is irrelevant, as the means are the ends according to the ritual. As the ritual is the contract with the devil, which has already given them their profits and is merely receiving its rewards at the back end.